Thank you for so faithfully walking this path of Holy Week together with me. Today is Thursday of our working on different aspects of incarnation of the Christ being, the process that led to generating, providing, on one hand, the body for the Messiah, on the other hand, providing the soul quality, consciousness, chalice that would be able to support the spiritual being that incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth. Yesterday we spoke about what it took to develop a type of consciousness that Jesus of Nazareth had, what was necessary in the long evolutionary historical process. Those things are typically not spoken of in Christian churches, and yet they are integral to the work of the Christian community. In fact, they are absolutely necessary for understanding Christianity in our times, to understanding the future that Christianity is also initiating out of the mystery of Golgotha. Today is Thursday, the day of Jupiter, the day when the archetype of the Christian liturgy, of the Christian service, was installed, initiated. The event of the evening, the so-called Last Supper, in reality, from the perspective of our work, must be called the First Supper, the first, even morning meal. With that is connected the mystery of priesthood. In the letter to the Hebrews, the epistle to the Hebrews, included in the canon of the New Testament, the document which is ascribed traditionally to Paul of Tarsus, the author of this letter, of this document, presents Christ, Jesus, as the archetype of a priest. And through that connects Jesus, places him in the stream of tradition that is flowing through the aeons of humanity since the primordial times. And when there is a priest, there is a ritual. We live in very basic times from a certain point of view. We live in a very primitive times, when that part of human existence, that part of human experience, which was carried, which was addressed, which was symbolized by an office of priesthood, had withdrawn from the field of consciousness, to put it mildly, and to put it more radically, that part of our existence, the actual religious rite-based life, is more or less discontinued. We are able to talk about those things. We can talk and describe what ritual is. Out of the modern psychology, out of modern psychoanalysis, out of anthropology, there is a huge body of knowledge and description as to why people would have rituals, why peoples would have priests, why would they have their medicine men, why would they have their witch priests, going back in the anthropological history of mankind. And yet, as a civilization, we actually, on the wider scale, don't cherish that office, except churches that are either an echo of the past, like, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church or an Orthodox Church is. Priest and the liturgy there is in a way an echo, last remnant of the ancient past. Or the Christian community, the movement for religious renewal, which, strange as it may seem, coming out of this body of the spiritual science, being birthed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner in connection with the anthroposophical work, begins with priest ordinations, or a renewal of religion that was part of legacy of Rudolf Steiner, begins with the reinstalling or reinstitution of this ancient post, I can even say ancient vocation, that for aeons of human culture's development was always part of our becoming, priesthood. And when Rudolf Steiner spoke about the mysteries of priesthood that are the beginning of the movement for religious renewal, so at the core of the Christian community, he pointed out, he looked back at this mysterious, semi-mythological, legendary personality by name Melchizedek. And quite distinctly, quite clearly, Rudolf Steiner speaks about the mysteries, the sacrament of priesthood in the Christian community as the renewal of the rite of Melchizedek, the newest branch of Christianity, the Christian community, is a renewal of the ancient branch on this tree. In the middle is the Last Supper, to which the letter to the Hebrews testifies, comparing Christ, Jesus, to Melchizedek, in fact, claiming that Christ has taken the ancient post of Melchizedek from that time on. He is, according to the fragment that is also on the page that I gave you today, the eternal priest. Jesus Christ is the eternal priest. When you say eternal, today in our modern language, we could, with justification, reduce it to the concept of archetypal, something that is preceding all subsequent forms. We spoke about this long path, evolutionary spiritual path, in which the spiritual being, supersensible being, that at the get-go, at the beginning, has no name. Without name, however, works as a will impulse, shaping the entire genetic and bloodstreams, shaping, carving into human body. On a way of that process, gradually, on one hand, descends closer to the human being. On the other hand, in consequence of these actions, of this will, human being becomes more and more progressively able to recognize and name the source of these deeds, of this process. Fairly at the beginning of the story of Abraham, who, as you remember, out of what we were contemplating here, is first man, human being, who is in direct possession of his organ of brain as the organ of consciousness, is first human being, in fact, on earth. This is kind of blessed and imprinted on him through the deeds of a spiritual being, which Abraham himself recognizes as a central, impulse-giving, destiny-shaping divinity, very different from spiritual beings and beliefs of the Babylonians. This God's name is Yahweh. From the point of view of the dynamics and relationships within spiritual hierarchies, Yahweh is one of 7 Elohim who took the task of preparing the path for the incarnation of the highest God, and he is responsible, so to speak, for separating, carving into the Abrahamic stream, changing the consciousness, changing the constitution of the human being, so that in the future, Jesus of Nazareth, coming out of the stream, can become the vehicle, the chalice for the highest spiritual being, the one that is gradually descending towards the earth. This Yahwehic influences, the spirituality was in different forms of the antiquity, in different forms also aside of the Abrahamic stream, cherished and recognized in the temples of the moon as a kind of a masculine aspect of the moon divinity. And this is related to the fact that Abraham, as I told you on Monday, was not just what we often, without justification, made out of him some common shepherd, or he was actually a shepherd, he was a priest of moon divinity, nameless still at that point, in Ur, in Babylonia. And out of his priestly deeds, at some point of his, we can imagine, service at one of the splendid temples of Babylonia, he receives the impulse to leave the past and go forth towards the land that is promised for him, the land where this new stage of evolution can take place, which in consequence will deliver body and consciousness into which Christ will be able to incarnate thousands of years later. And on the way through his journeys, which is on one hand geographical, that's how it is depicted in the Bible, but in reality it's a journey of becoming, it's a biographical journey. Abraham is able, through stages of very critical developments, recognize the voice of the one who calls him as the Lord, the one unifying element in the world. At that time of the stage of evolution, the regent, so to speak, working on behalf of the spiritual being we later know as Christ, to prepare the way for his coming. At some point of his story in the Holy Promised Land, chapter 14 of Genesis, there is this strange meeting between this highly developed leader of humanity that Abraham is, the avant-garde, the pinnacle, the leader of the new humanity, meets a priest who, in the words of the book of Genesis, is known as the priest of God Most High. There's only one time in Genesis that this name in the Hebrew language, El Elyon, the God El of all gods, is mentioned. And this God of all gods has a priest. This is a sculpture that is over a portico of one of the naves, one of the entrances to the cathedral at Chartres. This is how 13th, 14th century sculptures, artists imagine Melchizedek. Melchizedek here holds the chalice, and in the other hand holds the censer. In the chalice, we must imagine, is under the little dome is a piece of bread. And so, clothed in these priestly attributes, Melchizedek meets and greets Abraham. And Abraham 1,000 years ago, approximation 4,000 years ago, receive communion in the form of bread and wine from this mysterious priest of God Most High. And it's interesting when you read that narrative, Melchizedek literally appears from nowhere, gives Abram communion in the form of bread and wine, receives from him the tenth of Abraham's possession. The institution of the tithe begins with this description, and then he withdraws. He's never to be seen again. Through the entire books of the Old Testament and New Testament, until the letter of Hebrew, in which the author of this document says, pointing out to the Last Supper, Melchizedek is reborn, renewed, is reinstituted. In fact, he came to himself in the moment of Christ's breaking bread and sharing his blood, wine, in the event of the Last Supper. Something that today is often not considered seriously enough. From one point of view, of course, again, anthropology doesn't speak anything interesting about the rites. Actually, on the other hand, Christians often have a certain fear making that connection, direct connection between Melchizedek and the Christ. Why? Because out of the spirit of our times, materialistic spirit, it is very easy, it's very intelligent to think, to say, oh, well, what Jesus did during the Last Supper is actually just imitating, is referring to a known tradition within Hebrew stream. But that's not what is happening. What is happening is a renewal, in fact, is a fulfillment of the rites of Melchizedek. This meeting between Abraham and Melchizedek, in the language of cosmology, can be, from certain point of view, presented in a picture of a meeting between moon priest, Abraham, and the sun, the giver of life and energy and light and warmth and love is the sun. Priestly representative of this mystery of the sun is Melchizedek. You remember from our previous talks, the moment when in the biblical accounts, Noah appears, this legendary mythological personality who is known in nearly all modern mythologies under different names, including, for instance, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written poetry of humankind. Same personality, Noah, is depicted under the name Utnapishtim. In Hindu tradition in India, Noah is known as Manu. And this Manu was responsible for bringing humanity out of this, through this crisis, which is known in the biblical language as the flood. You remember we spoke about it in details, what this flood actually was. We can just say today, under the image, legendary image of the flood, is a crisis that brought about complete change of conditions. Not only conditions of the human body, human consciousness, but also conditions of the natural world. Such crisis that the world that we have today, with our shapes, contours, light, darkness, seasons, weather, weight, whatnot, has only actually begun after the flood. And Noah, this great initiate of the sun, was given the task to reform, reshape, to carry the human being from the old times, pre-antediluvian, which is called in anthroposophy Atlantean times, to the post-Atlantean times. In the language of the Bible, it's a legend, as if, happens very quick. In reality, we're talking about stretches of time where we have to really exercise our brain-free thinking to be able to even imagine, touch what type of transformation it is we're talking about. The Bible is very sporadic. Spiritual science gives us tools to be able to develop perceptions of these primordial processes. So in a certain sense, one can also say, from the point of view what we're talking about, that Noah actually has this priestly dignity. He serves as an image of humanity and for humanity after the Atlantean crisis. This office, this priestly task, which is so disregarded nowadays, always has certain attributes. Just like Melchizedek is clothed in vestments, has those attributes of a priest: chalice, the paten, the censer. They're not just arbitrary things. In fact, when you look at the vestments that the priest wears at the altar in the Christian community, when you look at the different emanations and forms of these vestments that exist in different denominations, as we say, Orthodox Church, Catholic Church, and whatnot, when you look at the paintings from the catacombs, Christ Jesus is often also depicted wearing priestly vestments. And when you look at the description of, for instance, of the book of Numbers or Leviticus, Exodus, where the heavenly liturgy and priesthood is renewed again through Moses, these priestly attributes are always, in a way, related. The way we clothe our priests today is not random, it's not arbitrary. There is lower vestments, the black vestments, you don't see it. There is a white vestment, the alba. There are the belts that change with every season. There is the chasuble, the outer garment. There is a hat. There's a cape. Those things are archetypical. Humanity were using those vestments in different various forms and manifestations since the beginning of at least a post-Atlantean epoch. Why? Because in those vestments, just like the vestments of Melchizedek and the vestments of your priest, super sensible human being is presented to your senses. Super sensible human being is something that all of us is. Today we can't really clearly speak about it unless we go through esoteric development, esoteric training. Unless we know that there is an I, astral body, soul, ether body, physical body. Out of materialism reduced all this actually to the material phenomena. Out of materialistic point of view, we can only see physical human being, if we can. Decline and reduction happen over aeons of time too, until this recent time. Priests, just like medicine men in different cultures, would have this ceremonial clothing which would remind human being, confront human being, wake in human beings consciousness of the supersensible in us. This is the reason why we dress our priests in the Christian community only for in the context of the liturgy. Throughout the ages of this becoming, which on one hand is, yes, Christ's path towards incarnation, but on the other hand, paradoxically, is also entrance of the human being deeper and deeper into the world of matter, which in consequence means that we are not only losing capacity to see the supersensible more and more, we lose our sensitivity to our own spirituality, but at the time of the materialism, our spiritual constitution is almost completely dried up. This is part of the crisis of our times. Not intellectual materialism, but existential materialism. Think about even your own biographies, how different your life was before you knew that you have something like ether body, life body in you, that you have something like the soul. Do you have something like higher beings of our constitution? So all this, in short, went through the process of contraction together with contraction of the cosmic spiritual being that human being is, until the moment of almost extinguishing together. When Abraham meets Melchizedek, this eternal priest, mysterious priest, who actually steps out of the mystery temple of the sun, temple where the mysteries of the sun, with their highest attribute, bread and wine, were cultivated since the times of when Adam left paradise, is actually located under today's Jerusalem. It's described in this fragment when that Abraham meets Melchizedek by the Valley of the Kings, which is a historical, legendary name for Valley of Kidron, on the eastern slope of the holy city, Jerusalem. Must imagine that at those primordial times, that city was very different. There in the caves and caverns, the mystery of the sun was hidden and preserved for future times. And this priest, Melchizedek, and him alike, so the human beings belonging to this Noahidian stream, were in possession, they were clothed in the ether body, the son of Noah by name Shem. So if a human being was appointed to be a priest in Melchizedek's mysteries of bread and wine, had to separate himself completely from environment, was dedicated to the temple of Melchizedek, unbeknownst to the society around him, and through the initiatory rites would be literally bestowed with the imprint of the ether body, life body, the wisdom body, the memory body of Shem, who is one of the three sons of biblical Noah. And in case of this meeting between Melchizedek and Abraham, something even more radical takes place, namely that priest that comes across and greets him, blesses him, is clothed with the vestment, so to speak, that has both meaning. External vestment, but also is a representation of the ether body, something super sensible, of Shem. And in that constitution, in that body, the I, the spiritual being of Noah, is presented. So the son initiate himself blesses Abraham. And we can ask ourselves why. Abraham, remember we spoke about it, was on the way, had a task to prepare this moon intellectual form into which both bodily and cultural, into which Christ could descend. So why would the son initiate something that is hidden, that is from the past, and only in the future will emerge in its full glory? Why would he make himself known to Abraham? And the reason for that is exactly to make sure that Abraham understands what is his task, and with him, entire Abrahamic stream. It doesn't have a purpose, just like Yahweh does not have a purpose in just for himself, for itself, but is paving the way, is a necessary building stage process for the highest spiritual being, El Elyon, the highest God, to, in a given right moment of time, to descend into and heal those sheets of the human being that in time and process of evolution gradually dried away, died off. And this happens in the 3 years of Christ's incarnation in Jesus. We must imagine that this Jesus of Nazareth was already, through these processes of 1,000 years, predestined and carefully shaped, created. That body was unique. And yet still had, to a certain degree, imprints of the fall. To certain degrees. Comparing to an average human being, was still very refined and divine, but nevertheless, Jesus of Nazareth was a human being who was born in this world. And you see it described in the events, kind of critical events of the 3 years, when these stages in which the being of the God Most High, El Elyon, the chosen one, is healing different levels and sheets of the constitution of the human being, starting with Jesus of Nazareth. Of course, it's not a passive process, because every time this crisis, biographical crisis of 3 years comes to Jesus, he responds to that with his act of goodwill, with his inner work. And the first stage, where the human eye is being quickened in Jesus to the consciousness of our divinity, is the baptism at Jordan. The second stage, in which the soul, the astral body, the inner constitution of inner consciousness of Jesus of Nazareth, is being gradually brought back to its divine origins, where the soul is no longer just my and your soul, but is actually a reflection of the splendor of the starry heavens. That's why it's called astral body. This is happening in the process between the temptations and the feeding of the 5,000. Out of the stars, out of his astral body, healed astral body, Jesus is able to feed the crowds, which is not necessarily a physical act, but a spiritual act of providing a soul nourishment forever. Everybody who is related to Christ has this capacity too towards the future. Even if the world will go through incredible hardships, out of our soul, Christian soul, we will be able to permeate the world with content, feed thousands. This comes to the highest point in that picture. The Christ is walking on a water. This is a spiritual imagination picture. That means that there's a kind of consolidation of the astral body of Jesus of Nazareth. His astral body is completely pure, becomes a gemstone, spirit self. The next stage, when yet deeper Christ being, the El Elyon, is penetrating the body of a human being, is depicted in the picture of the transfiguration on Mount Tabor, where the life body of Christ, ether body of Jesus, is being permeated with the original purity. Peter, John, and James see that. They can see that the body of their masters shining like the sun. Ether body, life body, is being purified from any shadows and shades of the earth existence. It shines as the sun itself. And finally, the most critical stage of that process of the 3 years, the most difficult, begins with Holy Week, where the Christ being, in the pictures and descriptions of these 7 days, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, reaches the deepest depths of the human body. The rays of the original spiritual sun penetrate and break through all the way to the bone mineral part of the constitution of the human being. And the culmination of that is in the hour of death at 3 p.m. on Good Friday. Elyon, the originator, the creator, the model, archetype meets its model. They become one. And as such, it allows the Lord, the Christ, to do something that is not possible due to the fact that our sheets are polluted through karma, through destiny, namely to go through death. Goes even deeper than a physical mineral constitution part of us, goes into the sub-material realm, which in the mythology language of the Gospels would be called hell. Something that is in a state of perpetual chaos. That's into those realms, the consciousness of God, the ray of light, goes with the death of Jesus on the cross. And this process, these 4 stages, we must imagine that they are imprinted, they are become visible in the vestment of the priest. We all have these sheets in us. So each of us has an alba and belts and the black cassock underneath. But part of the priestly service is to carry them in such way that they can become a visible sign of that process within us, members of the community. It's true. Christ is present in the act of consecration of man every time you celebrate it. We have to take it literally, all the way to our sense impressions. We see the Christ in the form of these fabrics also, not only. According to the Goethean principle, the visible is just the indication of eternity. That process that doesn't end there. It's not just we enter the chapel, say, oh, I see a fellow in investments, I see the Christ. No, but it's an invitation to go through the visible into the eternal. This is the signature of Christ's incarnation. Incarnation, death, and resurrection is a completely new element in the spiritual life of humanity, that we can know the divine through what is seen. And out of this liturgy of bread and wine, we, on one hand, develop organs to be able to later to go out into the world and do just that. To realize that everything around us is a material form, physical body of supersensible beings. It's kind of a spiritual process that is calcified or hardened. And through our love, through our devotion, through our humility in our souls, we can start reversing this process for the future. And in that regard, this festival, this ritual on bread and wine that connects actually long stretches of human cultural, spiritual, religious experience, that bread and wine that emerged with Melchizedek is not the first time that is indicated in the Bible. When do you remember is the first time that bread and wine is indicated, at least? Right at the beginning of the book of Genesis, in the story of Cain and Abel. Cain attempts to bring about offering, not yet bread and wine, but its precursors, the grains and the grapes. And that is at that point rejected by the divine world, at least by the divine world where Yahweh, the spirit of the moon, is the regent. It would be way too soon. It goes together with Cain, the mystery of bread and wine. That means also mystery of human culture. Because what is bread and wine? They're in a way the most representational, most archetypical aspects of our common work. You can even say that that bread and wine is an extract of the societal, economical, cultural production process that Holy Week, and a week is actually that body where society, where the soul of society dwells. It is currently a grave, but in time, when the Christ consciousness will permeate our life together, not only individual lives, but our community lives, societal lives, it will be lifted from the grave. That means that also the products of our societal life will be elevated, will be redeemed, will be actually able to create together. And the symbol of that creating together, you can think about the process: bread, salesperson in the store, the baker, the one who thrashes the seeds, the farmer. This is a chain that is being kind of incarnated in the form of the bread that you see at the altar. Same with the grape juice. And when Christ says, "This is my body this is my blood, he actually reveals his being among the human beings on a completely new, radical level. He says, even after I'm gone as an individual human being, as the risen one, you will be able to more and more see my presence, my being in the fruit of your work together as society. This mystery of living together, where it's no longer just a religion out of choice, whom I believe or who's my God. In fact, this becomes a visible liturgy symbol of a task that no longer a chosen folk has, and a chosen folk, but humanity as a whole. Through that, you can imagine that what we have today as, for instance, cultural forms, economical forms, political forms, they're all dead. They're not yet permeated through Christ. And when we see that in the service, that the bread and wine becomes the vehicle of, or the chalice and the host for the highest God, for the human being, restored human being, that brings our religious life on a completely different universal level. That's an indication of the far future. Three types of priests that we see in the gospel, three very different aspects of this priesthood. So something that represents, in the eye of the beholder, a universal quality, diluted, distilled in our soul. One is Melchizedek. The second one is this individuality by name Phinehas. Phinehas appears in the stage of human evolution in the book of Numbers. This is one of the 5 Mosaic books. You have it here on the page. That's the second quote, Numbers 25. Those pictures from the Old Testament, very often today they are met with certain antipathy, and we see them as very cruel or very, very categorical. Rightly so, on one hand, human evolution, human being is somewhere else, legally, morally, and so forth. But we must also understand that when we read those descriptions, they are not descriptions of only physical, actual acts and facts. They are actually description of the impressions that these facts, outer facts, made on the soul of the initiate who wrote the books. So they are actually a description of an inner process that came about out of observation of formal facts. So very often that means blood and slaying and all those things. That means not exactly always what we today formally recognize as, for instance, killing or blood and so on. Pictures of imagination. And yet, through them, through the clouds of imagination, the content, actual content is given. And here's the situation that after 40 years of roaming the desert, looking for themselves, those 40 years in the desert, they go once again through a total metamorphosis of their constitution, biological, genetic, soul constitution. And only then they can enter the promised land. Otherwise, the distance between Egypt and Goshen and the Holy Land is actually 12 hours of drive in a vehicle today. Doesn't take 40 years. So those 40 years is actually a process of initiation of an entire nation that the Hebrews had to go through when they left Egypt and before they actually developed these new capacities of consciousness. And just about there to enter, they did enter the new land, they come into contact with the folks, with the nations, which are a remnant, echo remnant of the old consciousness that they were trying to leave painfully. And those Midianite women is something that in the Hebrew is described as a form of sacral prostitution. It's something that is an echo of the rites that were legitimate and cultivated 1,000 years later in the Babylonian temples. In the meantime, they fell into a decadence, so that if you can think that the sexual sensual love has its archetype actually in the highest communion, in the unity between human being, the soul, and the divine being. But being subject to laws of earth and the laws of the adversaries, they gradually fell and not only became detached from this original longing for communion, but became also the tool of the adversary forces. And adversaries are sending those temple prostitutes to the encampment of the Hebrews, not only to tempt them, but in essentially to lead them away from their path that they are given task to fulfill. That's why they start worshiping Baal of Peor. There's a great religious retrogradation as if. And even Moses, with his incredible powers and insight and his moral authority, is not able to do anything against it. And then out of seemingly nowhere, this young man, pure-hearted zealot, or someone devoted to the will of God, takes things in his own hands. And this is represented in many forms of art, that he takes a spear, and when this one of the Hebrews is so arrogantly challenging the whole congregation around him, he says, I don't care what you guys think or say. I love this woman. She's going to be with me. Takes her into his dwelling. Phinehas takes the spear and pierces both of them, kills them. And by this, he stops this possibility of going astray. So how can we understand this picture, mythological picture, as something that pertains to actually universal value of a human actions or morality, rather than just killing of something that is dangerous or doesn't fit into our schedule? Well, the key to that is that spear. And spear appears in the language of the Old Testament only a few times in a very specific moments. And of course, a spear, you remember from Wagner's Parsifal, is this central attribute of the story of Parsifal, at least in the Wagnerians' take. It's all about the spear. And a spear as a symbol, as a letter in the religious spiritual language, is that element in us that is giving us uprightness. The spear of the spirit, that clear intuition that is not passive but is actually active, piercing something through. Perception. Words perception comes from perceive, which has to do with the spear. Word parsival is related to that too. So this young man has that capacity to see beyond the untruthfulness and the deceptions of the adversary, and using that spear, a sharp ray of the sun, he brings end to that critical situation for the entire chosen stream. And for that, he's being given a title of eternal priesthood. So one can ask, where are these Phinehas-like priests today too? When am I, where are you manifesting Phinehas with his lance, with his spear of the sun, when confronting untruthfulness, when confronting that which comes to us with life today? It's important that we cultivate the relationship with this Phinehas. And according to the Jewish legend, and later confirmed by Rudolf Steiner, the same spirit that was incarnated as Phinehas later reappeared in Elijah. Also comes into confrontation with the priests, with the representative of other streams that are actually not pro-human, pro-Christ, but they're out of a relationship with adversarial forces, just like today. They do everything to undermine, to destroy that chalice, to destroy that hose that is necessary for the Christ forces to carry us into the future. The spiritual distraction, spiritual pest. Finally, the third incarnation after Elijah is John the Baptist, who too challenges the authorities, challenges authorities who, instead of representing and being symbols of moral progress of the humanity, they abuse their powers and get in touch with the black magical forces. For that, John loses his head. That in turn is a very important stage in Christ Jesus becoming essentially at some point the new high priest for the new humanity. What does it mean that he becomes the high priest? New seeing, the new perception, the new spirituality begins with perception of Jesus, just like it started for Paul of Tarsus. Just like through seeing bread and wine at the altar, which become vehicles, dwellings of the supersensible, something invisible becomes visible. So also, when you look at the human being in front of you, you must be able to say to yourself, what I see right now in front of me is just a vehicle of the current stage of the becoming of an eternal being, which has past, beginning in the spiritual world, goes just like I go through the stage of the incarnation, confrontation with the forces of the adversary. It's like me in the crisis, trying to find his or her way, and is also searching for the Christ, is also searching for this priest that will lead humanity out of the darkness of the death of matter.